Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, everybody, the House of Representatives recently passed the Respect for Marriage Act, which, as of the making of this video, is on its way to the United States Senate. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is intending to put it up for a vote sometime soon. I don't know when. But the Democratic Party is currently trying to whip votes in favor of the bill, particularly on the Republican side. And so far, they've already gotten something of a commitment from Susan Collins and a terse and a tentative commitment from Senator Tillis of North Carolina, who said that he probably will vote for it. And this is bringing up an issue that has been part and parcel, or was part and parcel to Republican politics for practically decades. And only began not being such a big issue when Obergefell happened. Even when Obergefell happened, you saw some discourse in Republican circles around this very issue. Now, we should probably understand, just about 16 or so years ago, as of the date of this video, the Republican Party was pushing for the federal marriage amendment, which would have, among many other things, essentially enshrined in the Constitution the quote-unquote traditional definition of what marriage is between one man and one woman, which would have made it a complete and utter impossibility for any couple of different sexes to get married in the United States. It would have been a constitutional impossibility. Now, I think that anyone, regardless of what you think of what marriage is or whatever, should actually be quite happy that didn't happen. Because personally, and as the title of this video says, I'm quite tired of the government getting involved in marriage. And I think that the best thing that can happen for both the progression of civil society and also the reinforcement of natural liberty and the spirit of contract that undergirds American civil society, the best thing to happen for those two objects there is for marriage to come under the complete heel of privatization and to escape the clutches of bureaucracy and government taint that it has been under since the inception of this union. Which is why I think the Respect for Marriage Act would be better termed, rather, a misunderstanding of Marriage Act, or something of that sort, because in all honesty, if they truly respected marriage, which would be at the heart of the matter, respecting contractual relationships between two people, they would want to leave the terms of that contract to be dictated by the people involved, not by busybodies who believe they have some broader fundamental obligation to the common good to dictate the terms of your relationships to you. And this is what marriage has been for almost all of American history. And so I intend to walk you down a history of marriage in America, and I intend to discuss some of the Enlightenment notions surrounding marriage. And I also intend to present a few traditionalist arguments that would go against my proposition and say that I'm incorrect due to my opinion on marriage. But let me first start by saying this. I think that marriage is fundamentally important to a civil society. And I'll even say this. I think that monogamous marriage is fundamentally important to a civil society. And I'll explain my reasoning later. But let's understand what the American founders had when they had this idea of marriage in their head, because ultimately, if we want to get the government out of marriage, we have to understand how the government first got involved in marriage in the American political context in the first place. If we were to do a broader history of marriage, we'd probably go back to ancient societies where polygyny, and was basically the most widest form of polygamy, where men can have multiple wives, was actually the accepted form of marriage in many societies. Now, as of today, according to Pew Research, only 2% of global households are polygamous. A lot of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not really a big phenomenon. Even in the countries where those households are polygamous, it's a very small percentage point. But the fact that there's any human being living in that type of arrangement should say something to you people, to you guys. It should absolutely say something. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So for a lot of history in different countries, marriage simply wasn't between two people, right? Marriage was between multiple people. And in some instances, like in parts of the Bible, where King Solomon had many hundreds of wives and many hundreds of concubines, there was certain kinds of behavior, like in ancient Hebrew culture, where marriage to multiple people was also praised. Now, similarly, there was also instances in the Bible where marriage to one person was modeled as well. So that we should keep that in mind. But the American founders had a political theory of marriage. And this idea comes from the book Public Vows, which basically discusses marriage in the context of the American experiment. And in the book Public Vows, the author argues rather forcefully, and rather convincingly I might add, that the American founders were deeply influenced by Montesquieu, Bertrand de Montesquieu, the French philosopher, whose book, The Spirit of Laws, I actually have right here on my desk. I encourage all of you to pick up a copy of it. It's a very dense and long book, but I think that it's worth reading if you want to understand A, the roots of the American constitutional order, two, the roots of the American political structure, and C, a different perspective on natural law than you're probably used to hearing from me or from any other person you may listen to in our contemporary political discourse. Back to the topic. So they had this political theory of marriage, and marriage, at least marriage as it came to be in the Enlightenment, the sort of Christian monogamous marriage, which was a emphasis for moral philosophers in this period more generally, as a sort of boon to the social order. Marriage is a sort of tool to reinforce social order. This idea was deeply important to the founders, and I'll read some of what the book says right here. The book says that political thinkers and moral philosophers at the time of the founding, were conscious of monogamy as a system to be justified and navigated. European political theorizing had long noted that legal matrimony benefited social order by harnessing the vagaries of sexual desire and supplying predictable care and support for young independent. The Republican theory of the new United States assumed this kind of utilitarian reasoning and went beyond it to give marriage a political reason for being. From the French Enlightenment author Bertrand de Montesquieu, whose Spirit of Laws influenced central tenets of American republicanism, the founders learned to think of marriage and the form of government as mirroring each other. They aimed to establish a republic enshrining popular sovereignty, ruled by a government of laws and characterized by moderation. Their Montesquieuian thinking tied the institution of Christian modeled monogamy to the kind of polity they envisioned as a voluntary union based on consent. Marriage paralleled the new government. This thinking propelled the analogy between the two forms of consensual union into the Republic nation's self-understanding and identity. Now, of course, as the revolution went on and as the nation was established, this idea of the political theory of marriage was more cemented. But the idea behind this is this: marriage being a consensual, voluntary obligation, about voluntary association that brings about multiple other interpersonal obligations, was important to ensuring a social order, a certain kind of social order too, because it couldn't have just been any kind of marriage. It had to be monogamous Christian marriage. And of course, not all the founders were Christian or whatever, but the founders understood the value of the structure that was championed by the Christian establishment at that time. And not only that, but the founders also understood, in order to have a nation that has liberty and is based on contract, you have to have some sort of binding tie to the social order. And so marriage became not simply a contract between two individuals, but a contract between two individuals, the state, the people in the community, and anyone else who could possibly have an interest in the relationship of these two people as moderated by the government. This is where the problem started. The founders were absolutely correct that a virtuous people are necessary for the execution of liberty. The founders were absolutely correct that structure, and particularly certain interpersonal structure, absolutely is conducive to the progression of society. But the founders were incorrect to allow or to encourage or to even be silent in the face of state governments crafting laws surrounding marriage. Because what happened ultimately? Well, what happened was states that had certain values would use marriage as a social institution, and the social and the political being so wedded in this instance, they would use marriage as an attempt to showcase their personal values and forcefully impose them upon the people in the marriages. Marriage became a political tool, a sort of messaging system for the community to reflect the general values of everyone else in that community, regardless of the values of the people in the relationship. So the relationship of marriage became not about love and cultivating desire and duty obligation between the two people, but rather it became about serving the common good, or what could be understood as the common good in our modern parlance, in a way that the government can ensue. So this is why in certain Western states, because the states regulated marriage in America, in certain Western states, a white person and an Asian person couldn't get married. There was a great antipathy towards Asians in a lot of Western states for a good majority of America's, for a sizable portion of America's history. Before the Civil War and the legal abolition of slavery, the ability to be married was not afforded to slaves because, in the view of those in society, but this happened both in the southern states and in the northern states, by the way, in the view of those in society, those who were slaves were less than human. They weren't human at all. And their race was the reason as to why they were not human. Again, the social value of that kind of racism and their understanding of humanity, those social values were implanted upon the institution, were implanted upon the condition of the institution. And this, my friends, is the fundamental problem with governments and society meddling with these institutions. The values of society are so various, they are so individualized, and they are so particular to particular areas. And the fact that values of society are so specific to particular areas means that different people are going to have different ideas about how certain things can run. You can take the same structure of monogamous marriage with two people and give it to 5 different people, and those 5 people will have different ways they run their marriage. Perhaps the husband will be the one who does the cooking, and the wife works. That happens these days. Back then, that wouldn't have happened. Back then, marriage was meant to be a tool for the entire family to be integrated and reliant upon the man. The man was the head of the household. The wife was not considered a distinct person. The man, back in these days, the colonial days and the days after the American founding and for a very long time, the man was considered to be the vessel of political life. No one else in that family spoke up but the man. But again, when the values of people in certain structures progress, what happens to those structures? Well, they either adapt or they fall apart. Now, as for marriage, I don't think it will fall apart because the ideas surrounding the roles of men and women, these are ideas that, again, were given to us by society. They've got some basis in nature. Women tend to be more nurturing and caring than men are. Men can be nurturing and caring as well, but men have a lot more bravado and masculine energy, generally. However, these impulses don't have to dictate how we live. These impulses don't necessarily give us any sort of moral prescription. The moral prescription that all of us have, as per our humanity, nothing to do with our sex or our gender, as per our humanity, is to respect obligations between two people, or maybe more people, to respect life, to respect property, and to respect someone else's liberty, which is also respecting life. You don't have to be a certain sex or gender to do that. But for so long, society could only view men and women in these boxes. And so, marriage reflected this narrow thinking. And how did marriage reflect this narrow thinking? Because the government was involved in marriage. The government set the conditions for what was considered an actual marriage. And those conditions reflected social attitudes. And social attitudes are not always correct. But when you have a government as an institution and an instrument to forward social attitudes, what happens? Social attitudes can be implanted into certain things by force. That is why marriage is now a contentious issue on a federal level. It's simply an evolution of governmental involvement in marriage. It went from smaller control in states to bigger control at federal government, to more universalized control, which is why you had senators, or rather you had congresspeople saying that the federal government should not be trying to give its own version of marriage to every other state in the union. But how about this? No state, no government, state or federal, should be implanting its personal biases upon a union that I decide to enter with someone regardless of what sex they are. That is the only moral conclusion if you respect the law of contracts, that contracts are agreements that arise from the consensual wills of both parties coming together to create something. That's also society, by the way. Society is very much that of contract. People don't want to admit that, but it very much is. Because the argument that's always happens is that when the moment you reduce marriage to simply a contract, which is not really simple, by the way. Contracts can be quite complex. But the moment you reduce marriage to a contract, you take away, and you let anyone be married, you take away its procreative effect. I want you guys to listen to the argument of Mr. Alan Combs here, who is a presidential candidate, someone who I've known about for a while, and he made this argument, which seemed compelling to people when he debated Barack Obama, Alan Keyes, excuse me. And Keyes most certainly was the more compelling of the two. Don't get me wrong, from a political standpoint, he was. But here's what Mr. Keyes had to say about this very topic, about the topic of marriage, when he debated Barack Obama.
Mr. Keyes, on the Channel 7 debate last Thursday night, you said, and I'm quoting you, where procreation is in principle impossible, marriage is irrelevant. You went on to say it was irrelevant and not needed. What about marriage between people who are well beyond their childbearing age? Irrelevant, not needed?
No, it's simply a misunderstanding. The word in principle means relating to the definition of, not relating to particular circumstances. So if an apple has a worm in it, the worm is not part of the definition of the apple. It doesn't change what the apple is in principle. So the fact...
It retains its appleness.
If it retains... It retains... To act as if concepts are laughable means that you want to be irrational. Human beings reason...
You said it was irrelevant and not needed.
Human beings reason by means of concepts and definition. We also make laws by means of definitions. And if you don't know how to operate with respect for those definitions, you can't make the law. An individual who is impotent or another who is infertile does not change the definition of marriage in principle. Because between a man and a woman, in principle, procreation is always possible. And it is that possibility which gave rise to the institution of marriage in the first place. As a matter of law, as a matter of law
possible
and government.
in principle.
But when it is impossible, as between two males or two females, you're talking about something that's not just incidentally impossible, it's impossible in principle. And that means that if you say that that's a marriage, you are saying marriage can be understood in principle apart from procreation. You have changed its definition in such a way as, in fact, to destroy the necessity for the institution. Since the only reason it has existed in human societies and civilizations was to regulate, from a social point of view, the obligations and responsibilities attendant upon procreation. So when you start playing games in this way, you are actually acting as if the institution has no basis independent of your own arbitrary whim.
Okay, so there are a few things there that I think were incorrect. First of all, Keyes is quite eloquent, and he's probably pretty brilliant, but he was incorrect in that entire statement. Number one, marriage is not simply... Well, first, you have to ask yourself, when he says in principle, by what principle does he mean? Does he mean in principle in terms of the kind of marriage that has been heralded since the christening of American society, since the beginning of American society? Okay. Does he mean the kind of marriage that has been heralded amongst Mormon communities in the 19th century in America, which was polygamy and not anything to do with monogamy? I mean, when you say in principle, you have to genuinely think, what principle are you referring to? Marriage, being a social structure, has no universal form. Only certain kinds of marriage have universal form. So Mr. Keyes is also confusing categories. He's making a category mistake. He's assuming that all marriage has one form, when in all reality, different marriages have different forms. Obviously, monogamy is superior. I'll explain in a second. But not all marriage is monogamous, right? The term marriage is not necessarily connoted with monogamy. It has become that way over history. That's one thing. But he also is mixing up value structures and social structures. Marriage is a social structure, which is meant to cultivate certain values, but no structure alone can cultivate values in the hearts of man. Man has to be willing to apply his will to certain ideas and concepts and then turn them into action, turn them into uses for that structure. If two married people were married but didn't love each other, didn't feel as if they had any obligation to each other or any care to each other, then how in the world would that structure itself cultivate values? It wouldn't. Marriage is simply the vessel, but if the ship has no captain, that ship will remain in the sea until it is swallowed by a tsunami. This is what Keyes doesn't get. This is what so many traditionalists don't get. Structure and value systems are related in many cases, but they're not the same. You need the other for one to work. And this is why I think monogamy is actually universally applicable regardless of sex. My friends, monogamous marriage is beneficial for everyone, whether they are a gay couple or a straight couple, because monogamous marriage actually allows people to understand and practice the values that are required for an ethical life. And by that I mean, it helps the two people involved in that relationship understand the importance of duty and obligation within interpersonal relationships. Because to respect ethics outside of marriage, you also have to understand the duties that you have and the obligations you have to other people. You have a duty not to interfere with someone else's property. You have a duty not to unjustly take someone else's life. You have a duty not to unjustly take someone else's stuff. And the moment you violate these duties is the moment that society begins to have a disharmony between its members and its composition. And if everyone were to begin killing and pillaging and stealing, what would happen? Everything would fall apart. Complete and utter destruction would ensue. But these social obligations, which are actually based on nature, on the subterranean basis of natural law, allow us to continue to have society continue, but also what allows us to commit good ethical action. Marriage is a sort of practice course for that, and it's a very good way to also embody those values in your everyday life. That's why marriage is important. Marriage is not important because it's a vessel for procreation. There are plenty of other structures that can be vessels for productive procreation. That's a utilitarian argument. If we want to actually understand the principle of marriage is its deep ties to proper ethical values that we need to live good lives. That's why marriage is important. Not because it helps you procreate, not because it for 200 or so years has been considered to be man and woman, not because of any particular idea that Mr. Keyes has, but because it is a way to embody good values. Simple enough. My friends, the moment society gets involved in dictating the contracts that you make in your own personal life is the moment that you cannot truly pursue the values that are important. Because the values of society, especially of American society in the past, and even sometimes today, are not always the correct ethical values. If someone cannot marry because they are a certain race, or they cannot marry because they are from a certain place, or they cannot marry because the judge didn't want to give them the license that day, regardless of what it is, then they cannot fully live out the correct values. But if anyone can marry on the basis of their own will coming together in a contract with someone else, then oh my goodness, you have a much better system. Now, there's a lot of questions, a lot of objections, a lot of other things to consider when it comes to this topic, how legal benefits work, so on and so forth. That's not the goal of this video. The goal of this video is quite simple. It is to make the moral case for privatizing marriage. It is to make the moral case for homosexuals to also be able to marry in accordance with natural law. And it is to make the moral case that American society had the correct idea about virtue being necessary within the citizenry, but did not do themselves any favors when they made the government the enforcement of an institution which was supposed to instill virtue. Government is force. Force does not create anything. Force negates. Force destroys. To create virtue in the hearts of man, you need something bigger. You need will. You need intellection. You need values. None of those things arise from coercion. They all arise from discovery. And I hope that this video has helped you in some ways discover a new perspective. Think on it, my friends. I love you guys so much. If you love me, please be sure to go to my Patreon, patreon.com/officialcwatson, or my PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment on this video. My friends, I know this one is going to be very contentious, and there's lots I didn't address because, again, I don't want to go for hours. I will make a longer video about this. This video is the moral case, the practical considerations, and more of the objections will be answered soon. But until that point, my friends, I love you guys so much, and please, stay pensive. Bye, guys.